Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling and forgotten chapters in Appalachian history, a tale buried so deep in the mountains of West Virginia that even the earth itself seemed reluctant to give up its secrets. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. Not through sudden shocks or manufactured terror, but through the slow creeping realization that evil can wear the most unexpected faces, can build its throne in the most isolated corners of our world, and can thrive for years in plain sight while communities whisper, suspect, and yet do nothing. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned nearly a decade, buried deep in the hollers of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, where two sisters defied all expectations of femininity, hospitality, and human decency, transforming their remote homestead into a graveyard that swallowed travelers whole, and left a legacy so dark, so incomprehensible, that when the truth finally emerged, it shattered the very foundation of how a community understood itself. This is not simply a story of murder. It is a story of isolation breeding madness, of poverty creating desperation, of sisterhood twisted into something monstrous, and of a landscape so unforgiving that it became an accomplice to unspeakable crimes. It was the year 1932. The Great Depression was suffocating the United States, crushing the economy beneath a weight of unemployment, hunger, and desperation that seemed to have no bottom. Banks failed by the thousands. Factories stood silent. Bread lines stretched around city blocks while families lived in shantytowns they called Hoovervilles, named bitterly for the president they blamed. But if the cities suffered, rural America faced a different kind of apocalypse, one of isolation, of being forgotten, of watching the little you would slowly disappear while the outside world stopped caring whether you lived or died. In the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, the situation was different still. Here, the depression was less a sudden catastrophe than an intensification of hardships that had always existed. These mountains had never known prosperity in the way the industrial North understood it. The coal mines that had promised wealth to some had mostly delivered black lung, company stores, and generational poverty. The timber companies had carved out the old-growth forests and moved on, leaving behind eroded hillsides and depleted communities. What remained were people who had learned to survive on almost nothing, who knew these mountains with an intimacy born of necessity, who distrusted outsiders and authority in equal measure, and who kept their secrets as carefully as they kept their meager provisions. Greenbrier County sat in the southeastern portion of West Virginia, a landscape of breathtaking beauty and brutal indifference. Here the Allegheny Mountains rose in wave after wave of densely forested ridges, their peaks often lost in clouds that clung like shrouds. Valleys carved by ancient rivers created pockets of relatively flat land, where small communities clustered. But venture away from these settlements and you entered a wilderness that had changed little since the first European settlers arrived. Caves honeycombed the limestone beneath the earth, some mapped and known, others existing only as rumors and legends, as places where cold air exhaled from invisible openings, and where more than one person had vanished, lost forever in the subterranean labyrinth. The people who lived here were hardy, resourceful, and proud. They had to be. Winters brought snow that could isolate a homestead for weeks. Springs brought floods that washed out roads and bridges. Summers brought humidity that made the air feel solid. That turned every physical effort into an ordeal. And through it all, you survived by knowing your land, by maintaining good relations with your neighbors, because you might need them when disaster struck, and by minding your own business when it came to matters that didn't directly concern you. This last quality, this cultural reluctance to interfere, to pry, to involve oneself in the affairs of others, would prove crucial to our story. Because in a remote holler several miles from the nearest town, on a property accessible only by a rough trail that wound through thick forest and across a creek that became impassable during heavy rains, two women were building something terrible, and the community, despite whispers and suspicions, despite disappearances and rumors, would remain silent for far too long. Their names were Martha and Ida Hicks, though some records list the surname as Hickson, a confusion typical of a region where record-keeping was haphazard at best, and where many people signed legal documents with an X, unable to write their own names. The sisters were born in the late 1890s, making them women in their early 40s when our story truly begins, though the exact dates remain disputed. What isn't disputed is that they were twins, identical according to those who knew them, though no photographs survive to confirm this detail. In an era before modern documentation, before driver's licenses and social security numbers and digital records, it was possible to live an entire life leaving barely a trace. a reality the Hicks sisters would exploit to devastating effect. They had grown up in these mountains, daughters of a subsistence farmer who worked land that could barely sustain a family even in good years. Their mother died when they were young. Childbirth, some said, though others claimed it was consumption. That wasting disease that turned the sufferer into a ghost long before death arrived. Their father raised them with a harsh hand and little affection, teaching them to shoot, to trap, to butcher animals, to survive. When he died, thrown from a horse crushed beneath it when the animal rolled down a steep hillside, the sisters were in their late 20s, unmarried, and without prospects. This was unusual. In Appalachian culture of the early 20th century, a woman's path was relatively fixed. Marriage, children, a lifetime of backbreaking domestic labor that aged you beyond your years. Unmarried women in their 20s were already considered old maids, objects of pity or suspicion. Unmarried women in their 40s were anomalies requiring explanation. Were they too ugly? Too difficult? Too strange? The community around the Hicks sisters would have wondered all these things, would have crafted explanations that made sense of this deviation from the expected pattern. The truth was likely simpler and more tragic. The sisters were poor beyond imagining, living on land that barely produced enough to keep them alive. They were isolated miles from the nearest town, in a location that made socializing difficult even if they'd been inclined toward it. And they were, by all accounts, strange, not in ways that were immediately obvious or threatening, but in the accumulation of small oddities that made people uncomfortable. They dressed alike, moved in synchronization, finished each other's sentences. When you spoke to one, both would turn to face you. When one laughed, which was rare, the other would echo it exactly. It was as if they were not two individuals, but a single entity somehow split into two bodies. After their father's death, they could have left. They could have moved to town, sought domestic work, perhaps found late marriages to widowers in need of help with children and household. Instead, they stayed. They worked the failing farm, kept chickens and a few goats, tended a garden that produced sparse vegetables in the thin mountain soil. And at some point, whether immediately or gradually, whether through careful planning or dark opportunity, they began supplementing their meager existence in a way that would eventually reveal them as among the most prolific female serial killers in American history. To understand how their crimes remained hidden for so long, you must understand the geography that enabled them. The Hicks homestead sat in what locals called Devil's Holler, a name that predated the sisters' crimes but would seem grimly prophetic once the truth emerged. The holler was a narrow valley carved between two steep ridges, its floor following the course of a creek that ran clear and cold, fed by springs that never dried even in the worst droughts. The trail into Devil's Holler branched off from a larger path that connected several small communities. And this branch was easy to miss if you didn't know to look for it, just a gap between trees marked by nothing more than disturbed undergrowth and the faint impression of previous passage. The cabin itself was rough even by the standards of the area, built by their grandfather decades earlier. It was a one-room structure of notched logs with a stone chimney at one end and a loft accessible by a ladder. The roof was split shingles, many of them curling or missing, replaced by pieces of rusted tin that created a patchwork of materials. There were two small windows covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Glass was expensive, glass broke, glass required replacement. The door hung slightly crooked, never quite closing properly, so that wind whistled through the gap and brought with it the smell of pine and decay. Around the cabin, the sisters maintained several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. A chicken coop built against the hillside, partially dug into the earth for warmth in winter. A smokehouse for preserving meat, though what kind of meat would later become a subject of horrified speculation. A root cellar for storing vegetables, accessed by a slanted door set into the ground, its interior cool and dark even in summer. And further back, partially hidden by a stand of laurel thickets, a small barn that was mostly empty. They had no horses, no cattle, just space that echoed with absence. The landscape itself was both beautiful and ominous. In spring, the mountains exploded with wildflowers, trillium, bloodroot, wild geranium painting the forest floor in whites and pinks and purples. Dogwoods bloomed like white clouds caught in the branches of larger trees. Rhododendrons transformed entire hillsides into walls of color, but beneath this beauty lay danger. The terrain was treacherous, full of hidden drop-offs where one wrong step could send you tumbling down a cliff face. Copperheads and timber rattlesnakes sunned themselves on warm rocks, The caves that riddled the limestone could swallow you into darkness from which you might never emerge. Weather in these mountains was unpredictable and often severe. Fog could descend in minutes, turning a familiar trail into a confusing maze where every tree looked like every other tree. Thunderstorms rolled through with violence, lightning striking the exposed ridgetops and sending booming echoes through the valleys. Winter snows could drift 10 feet deep in places. And the cold was not the dry cold of the plains, but a penetrating dampness that seeped into your bones and never quite left. In this environment, the Hicks sisters were not merely residents. They were part of the landscape, shaped by it, adapted to it in ways that city dwellers could never understand. They knew every trail, every hollow, every cave entrance within miles. They could read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the feel of the wind. They could move through the forest with barely a sound, appearing suddenly on a path where a moment before there had been no one. To the few people who encountered them, they seemed almost supernatural, as if they had somehow merged with the wilderness until they were more elemental force than human being. The disappearances began to be noticed in 1933, though investigators would later come to believe the crimes had started as early as 1922. The first official missing person report involved a traveling salesman named Robert Cochran, a man in his 50s who worked for a company that sold household goods, medicine, and various sundries to rural families. His territory covered several counties, and his route took him along isolated roads and trails where customers might not see another salesman for months. Cochran was reported missing by his wife when he failed to return home after what should have been a week-long circuit. She told the sheriff that her husband was reliable, that he always sent word if he'd be delayed, that something must have happened. The sheriff, a practical man named Hargrove who had seen more than his share of misfortune, explained what everyone already knew. The mountains were dangerous. Men got lost. They fell from cliffs. They drowned crossing swollen creeks. They had heart attacks miles from help. Their bodies were found months or years later, if they were found at all, reduced to bones that told no story except that of death. Still, Hargrove made inquiries. He traced Cochran's route, speaking to families who had seen the salesman, who had purchased from him or sent him on his way. The trail went cold at a homestead about 5 miles from Devil's Holler. The family there remembered Cochran stopping by, making his sales pitch, selling them some thread and patent medicine. They'd pointed him toward the next farm, which lay in the direction of Devil's Holler, though they weren't sure if he'd planned to visit the Hicks sisters. Some peddlers avoided that place. The sisters had no money to speak of, and there was something unsettling about them, something that made people cut their visits short and hurry back to more welcoming locations. Hargrove rode out to the Hicks place. It was late afternoon when he arrived, the light already fading in the deep holler, shadows pooling beneath the trees. The sisters emerged from the cabin before he could dismount, moving in that synchronized way they had, both wearing identical faded dresses, both with their dark hair pulled back severely, both with expressions of polite inquiry that somehow felt rehearsed. Had they seen a traveling salesman? Perhaps, Martha said, or was it Ida? They looked so alike, and they switched off speaking so seamlessly that it was hard to keep track. A man had come by, though they couldn't recall exactly when. A week ago? 2 weeks? Time moved differently in the mountains. He'd tried to sell them things they couldn't afford. They'd sent him on his way. Which direction? They pointed vaguely east, toward a trail that would eventually connect to the main road several miles distant. He'd seemed fine, healthy, in good spirits. They hoped nothing bad had happened to him. Hargrove looked around. The homestead was poor but maintained. Chickens scratched in their pen. The garden, such as it was, showed signs of recent work. The cabin, though rough, wasn't falling apart. Everything seemed normal, perfectly, completely normal, and yet something made the sheriff uncomfortable. Some instinct honed by years of reading people and situations. The sisters were too calm, too helpful, too identical in their responses. And their eyes, dark eyes that watched him without quite meeting his gaze, held something he couldn't name but didn't like. He searched the immediate area around the cabin, looking for signs of disturbance, for anything that might indicate foul play. He found nothing. The sisters watched him from the porch, silent now, patient, waiting for him to finish and leave. Eventually he did. He rode back down the holler trail as the last light failed, and he didn't look back, though he felt their eyes on him the entire way until the forest swallowed him and broke that invisible connection. Cochran's body was never found. The case remained open but inactive. One more disappearance in a region where people vanished with tragic regularity. His wife mourned. The company sent a new salesman to cover his territory. Life continued. 6 months later, a drifter named Jack Sullivan went missing. Sullivan was a familiar figure in the area, a man who had once owned a small farm but lost it during the early years of the Depression. Rather than leave the mountains he loved, he'd taken to wandering, doing odd jobs for food and shelter, sleeping rough when necessary, slowly descending into the kind of poverty that eroded not just your circumstances but your sense of self. People were kind to him mostly. They'd let him sleep in a barn, would feed him in exchange for a few hours of work. But as the Depression deepened and everyone's resources grew scarcer, that kindness became rarer. Sullivan had to range further, had to take more risks, had to accept hospitality from people he might once have avoided. Someone reported seeing him heading toward Devil's Holler, though the witness couldn't be certain of the date. Sullivan had mentioned hoping to find work, had said something about 2 women who might need help with heavy chores. The witness had warned him, those sisters were strange, best to stay away, but Sullivan had shrugged. He couldn't afford to be picky. Work was work, he was never seen again. This time no one reported him missing for weeks. Drifters came and went. They had no families checking on them, no employers noting their absence. Sullivan's disappearance might have gone entirely unnoticed, except that a traveling preacher who knew him asked after him and learned that no one had seen him in an unusually long time. The preacher mentioned it to Sheriff Hargrove. Hargrove made a note. 2 missing men, both whose trails went cold in the same general area. It could be coincidence. The mountains were vast. Death found people, but the sheriff's instinct nagged at him. He rode out to the Hicks place again, this time unannounced, arriving in the middle of the day. The sisters were working in their garden, and they straightened slowly when they saw him approaching, tools in their hands. A hoe, a rake, implements that could be farming equipment or weapons depending on intent. He asked about Sullivan. Had they seen him? Had he stopped by looking for work? The sisters conferred silently. That strange wordless communication they seemed to share, and then Martha or Ida spoke. Yes, a man had come by. They thought his name might have been Sullivan, though they weren't certain. He'd wanted work. They'd had nothing for him. No money to pay, no food to spare. He'd seemed disappointed but not surprised. He'd asked about other homesteads in the area, other places that might need help. They'd directed him toward some farms several miles north. That was the last they'd seen of him. Did he seem sick? Hargrove asked. Injured? Like something might have been wrong with him? The sisters considered this. He seemed tired, one of them said. Like a man who'd been walking a long time, but not sick that we could tell. And you didn't offer him anything? Water? Something to eat? A long pause. We offered water from the well. He drank some and moved on. Hargrove studied them. Their story was plausible, even kind in its small way, offering water to a thirsty traveler. And yet that persistent unease gnawed at him. He asked to look around again, and the sisters stepped aside with identical gestures of permission, their faces expressing nothing. He examined the outbuildings more carefully this time. The smokehouse held some dried meat, squirrel, possum, maybe deer. It was hard to tell in its preserved state. The root cellar contained withered potatoes and some jars of preserved vegetables. The barn was mostly empty as before, though he noticed the dirt floor had been recently disturbed in places, as if something had been buried and then dug up again. When he asked about this, the sisters explained they'd been trying to level the floor, had dug out some stones. The explanation made sense, everything made sense, and nothing did. Hargrove left with the same uncomfortable feeling, the same sense that something was wrong but without any evidence to support his suspicion. He was a lawman in a remote county with limited resources, investigating the possible fates of men who had been, by society's measure, almost invisible, a traveling salesman whose route had been unpredictable, a drifter with no fixed address. There were no bodies, no witnesses to crimes, no physical evidence, just an absence where 2 men had once been, and a remote homestead occupied by 2 strange women, whose only apparent crime was being poor, isolated and unsettling. Through 1934 and into 1935, the pattern continued. More men disappeared, though more is a relative term because the disappearances were spaced far enough apart and involved men marginal enough that no one initially saw them as a pattern. A logger who'd been working a claim in the high country failed to return when his supplies ran out. A man traveling to visit family in the next county never arrived. A veteran of the Great War, shell-shocked and prone to wandering, vanished from the area entirely. Some of these disappearances had nothing to do with the Hicks sisters. In a region as unforgiving as Appalachian, West Virginia during the Depression, death was common and often came without witness. But investigators would later determine that at least 6 men, possibly more, disappeared along routes that took them near Devil's Holler during this period. 6 men whose final confirmed sightings placed them in that vicinity. 6 men whose bodies were never recovered. The breakthrough came not from detective work but from betrayal, or perhaps from guilt, though guilt seems a strange thing to attribute to the Hicks sisters, based on what happened next. In March of 1935, Martha Hicks, or Ida, the records are unclear and perhaps it doesn't matter, walked into Sheriff Hargrove's office in the county seat. She came alone, which was unusual. The sisters moved together almost always, 2 parts of an inseparable whole. But on this day, one of them made the journey by herself, riding a mule down from the mountains, covering miles of muddy spring roads to stand before the sheriff's desk and make a statement that would change everything. "There's something you need to know," she said, "about my sister, about what's been happening in the holler." What followed was one of the strangest confessions in the annals of American crime. The sister, for clarity's sake, records eventually identified her as Ida, though this remains disputed, claimed that her twin, Martha, had been killing travelers who came to their homestead. That Martha had been doing this for years. That Ida had been afraid, had been forced to help dispose of bodies but had not participated in the actual killings. That she could no longer remain silent, could no longer be complicit in her sister's evil. Hargrove listened to this confession with mounting disbelief and horror. He questioned Ida for hours and her story remained consistent, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that made it somehow more disturbing. Martha would invite travelers into the cabin, would offer them food and rest. She'd wait until they were comfortable, vulnerable, and then she'd strike, sometimes with an axe, sometimes with a heavy piece of firewood, sometimes with a gun if she could get close enough to ensure the shot would be immediately fatal and wouldn't attract attention from distant neighbors. The bodies, Ida claimed, were disposed of in several ways. Some were buried in the barn, in the forest, in places where the earth had been disturbed for seemingly innocent reasons and would raise no suspicion. Others were weighted with stones and sunk in deep pools of the creek during high water. And others, this detail would haunt the investigation, were allegedly fed to the hogs they'd kept for a time, animals that would consume anything organic and leave little trace. Why? Hargrove asked, the question inadequate but necessary. Why did she do it? Ida's answer was chilling in its simplicity. For their money. For their possessions. For what they had that we didn't. But you had so little. These were poor men mostly. What could they have had that was worth killing for?
More than we had, Ida said.
$1, a knife, a warm coat. When you have nothing, anything seems like everything. Hargrove organized a search party immediately. He deputized several men, enlisted volunteers from the community, and rode out to Devil's Holler with a grim determination. They arrived to find Martha Hicks at the cabin alone, unsurprised by their presence. When Hargrove informed her that she was under arrest for murder, she showed no reaction. No denial, no protest, no fear. She simply nodded as if acknowledging something long expected. "Your sister told us everything," Hargrove said, watching for her response. Martha smiled then, a small, cold expression that seemed to confirm every suspicion he'd ever had. "Did she said. "Everything?" The search of the property began immediately, and what they found would haunt the men who discovered it for the rest of their lives. In the barn, when they began digging in the areas where the earth seemed recently disturbed, they unearthed human bones. Scattered and incomplete, gnawed by animals but unmistakably human, a skull with a clear depression in it, consistent with a heavy blow, ribs showing cut marks from a blade, femurs, vertebrae, the small bones of hands and feet all mixed together like some nightmarish archaeological site. In the forest behind the cabin, in a shallow ravine hidden by rhododendron thickets, they found more remains. Some were relatively recent, tissue still clinging to bone, clothing identifiable. Others were older, reduced to skeletons that would require careful analysis to identify. The searchers worked in rotations because the smell, even in the cool spring air, became overwhelming. Men who had butchered animals their entire lives, who had seen death in all its rural forms, vomited and had to walk away. The creek yielded nothing despite extensive searching. The current had been too strong, the water too deep, the distance the bodies could have traveled too far. But in the root cellar, in sealed jars at the very back, hidden behind legitimate preserved vegetables, they found jars containing what appeared to be meat, but which later analysis would confirm as human tissue preserved in brine. The community reacted with a mixture of horror, fascination, and something like vindication. All those whispered suspicions, all that unease about the strange sisters in Devil's Holler had been justified. The story spread rapidly, carried by word of mouth and then by newspaper reporters who descended on the area like crows to carrion, eager for every gruesome detail. "Female ghouls of the mountains," one headline screamed. "Cannibal sisters in Appalachia," declared another, though evidence of actual cannibalism was never definitively proven. As the investigation deepened, a more complex and disturbing picture emerged. Ida's confession, it turned out, had been strategic, an attempt to portray herself as a reluctant accomplice, forced into cooperation by her dominant twin. But as Martha began to talk, and talk she did, seemingly eager now that silence was no longer necessary, a different story came to light. According to Martha, the killings had been a mutual decision, a survival strategy born of desperation. They had started small, she claimed, with theft rather than murder. They'd robbed travelers, taking their money and valuables, letting them go. But inevitably, some victims had threatened to report the theft. Some had fought back. Some had recognized the isolation of the location and the vulnerability of two women alone, and had thought to assault them, to take more than their hospitality. In self-defense, Martha claimed, they'd killed. And once they'd killed once and gotten away with it, the barrier had fallen. It was easy, Martha told investigators, her voice devoid of remorse. Easier than farming. Easier than starving. Men came through regular enough. They were strangers. Nobody knew exactly where they'd been or where they were going. And we needed what they had. She described the process with a chilling pragmatism. They'd developed a system. One sister would be friendly, welcoming, would invite the traveler to rest, to share a meal. The other would position herself behind the guest, would wait for the moment of maximum vulnerability, when the man was eating, when he was bent over washing his face, when he'd settled onto a chair and relaxed his guard. A blow to the head with whatever implement was handy. Most died instantly or near enough that they couldn't cry out. Those who didn't were finished quickly. The bodies were dealt with efficiently. They'd strip them of anything useful. Money, clothing, tools, personal effects. The clothes they'd sell or trade in different towns piecemeal, never enough at once to attract attention. Money they'd hide, spending it carefully over time. Tools they'd use or barter. The bodies themselves were butchered with the same skill they'd learned butchering animals, divided into manageable pieces that could be buried separately, in different locations, hidden in ways that the landscape itself would further obscure. How many? Hargrove asked, the question heavy with dread. Martha considered. I'm not certain. 10, 12. We didn't keep count. It was over years. Sometimes no one came through for months. Sometimes we'd get 2 in a week. We took who we could when we could. The trial, when it finally convened in June of 1935, drew crowds from across the state and beyond. The courthouse in the county seat had never seen such attention. Reporters filled the galleries. Curious onlookers camped outside, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous sisters. The judge, a stern man named Blackwood who had presided over the county's legal matters for 2 decades, struggled to maintain order as the proceedings unfolded. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the bodies, or what remained of them. They had both sisters' confessions, contradictory in details but consistent in the essential facts. They had testimony from people who'd seen various missing men heading toward Devil's Holler. They had the personal effects found at the Hicks homestead, items that families of the missing identified as having belonged to their lost loved ones. The defense, such as it was, attempted to argue diminished capacity. The sisters had been isolated, impoverished, driven by desperation to acts they never would have contemplated under other circumstances. They'd been shaped by hardship, by the Depression, by a landscape and culture that had abandoned them. Their attorney, a young man from Charleston who'd been appointed by the court, did his best, but his heart didn't seem in it. How could you defend the indefensible? How could you ask a jury to show mercy when the accused showed none themselves? Ida took the stand and maintained her story, that she'd been coerced, frightened, unable to escape her sister's influence. She wept as she testified, claimed she'd lived in terror, said she'd finally come forward because she couldn't let more people die. The prosecution destroyed her credibility systematically. They showed that she'd been seen making purchases alone, acting independently. They presented evidence that she'd been the one to sell several items belonging to victims. They pointed out that her decision to confess came only after it seemed inevitable that the crimes would be discovered anyway, not from any moral awakening. Martha was more straightforward. She admitted everything. She showed no remorse, no regret. Nothing but a cold practicality that stunned the courtroom into silence. When asked if she understood the magnitude of what she'd done, she replied, "I understand I did what I had to do to survive." "But you killed people," the prosecutor said. "Innocent people who'd done nothing to you. They had what we needed. We took it. That's how the world works." "That's not how the world works. That's murder," Martha shrugged. "Call it what you want. We're all just trying to get by." The testimony of those who'd known the victims was heartbreaking. Robert Cochran's widow described her husband, his dedication to his work, his plans for the future they'd never have. She held a photograph of him and asked through tears how anyone could have killed such a gentle man. Jack Sullivan's brother, who'd lost touch with him during the Depression but had hoped to reconnect someday, spoke of childhood memories and opportunities lost. Other families, other voices, each adding to the weight of loss that filled the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found both sisters guilty of murder in the first degree on multiple counts. Judge Blackwood, in pronouncing sentence, spoke of the gravity of their crimes, of the trust they'd violated, of the darkness they'd brought to the mountains. He sentenced both to death by hanging, to be carried out at the state penitentiary as soon as arrangements could be made. "You have shown," Blackwood said, his voice trembling with controlled rage, "that you possess no regard for human life, no capacity for remorse, no quality that might redeem you. You have made your home into a slaughterhouse and your hospitality into a lure for death. The state of West Virginia has no place for such evil, and this court has no mercy to extend to those who showed none themselves." The sisters listened without visible reaction. When asked if they had anything to say, Martha spoke for both of them. "We did what we needed to do. If we hadn't killed them, we'd have died ourselves. Starved or froze or just faded away like so many others. At least we survived for a while. At least we had something." It was a statement devoid of humanity, a reduction of existence to mere survival stripped of all moral dimension, and it left the courtroom in stunned silence. Because what could you say to such total absence of conscience? The executions were scheduled for August 15, 1935. In the weeks leading up to that date, the sisters were held in separate cells at the state penitentiary in Moundsville, a forbidding Gothic structure of stone that had housed West Virginia's condemned for decades. This forced separation marked the first time in their lives that Martha and Ida Hicks had been kept apart for an extended period, and it seemed to affect them in ways that their crimes had not. Ida became withdrawn, speaking rarely, eating little. She'd sit in her cell for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering to herself in what guards said sounded like one-sided conversations, as if she was still talking to her sister despite the walls between them. She accepted visits from a prison chaplain who tried to counsel her, to bring her to some understanding of her sins and some hope for divine forgiveness, but she seemed not to hear him. Her focus was internal, directed at something the chaplain couldn't reach. Martha, conversely, became almost talkative. She'd engage guards in conversation, would discuss the weather, would ask about news from the outside world. She showed interest in everything except reflection on her crimes. When the chaplain visited her and tried to discuss guilt and redemption, she cut him off. "I don't feel guilty," she said. "I did what I did. It's done. What would guilt change? It would mean you understood the wrong you'd committed. It would mean you had a soul capable of salvation." "I have a soul," Martha replied, "just not one that works the way you think it should. I understand what I did. I just don't feel the way you want me to feel about it." The chaplain left that visit shaken. He'd counseled murderers before, had sat with men who'd killed in rage or desperation or madness, but he'd never encountered someone so utterly unmoved by their own actions, so completely divorced from what he understood as basic human morality. He would later write in his diary that Martha Hicks was the only person he'd ever met who made him question whether some souls were simply beyond redemption, not because they'd sinned too greatly, but because they lacked the fundamental capacity for the kind of moral reckoning that redemption required. As the execution date approached, both sisters were offered the opportunity to write final letters, to make peace with family members or anyone else they wished to contact. Neither wrote anything. They had no family left that they acknowledged, no friends, no one in the world who mattered to them except each other. The warden, a practical man who'd overseen many executions, arranged for them to have a final visit together under heavy guard. The meeting took place 3 days before the scheduled hanging. The sisters were brought into a small room separated by a table, guards positioned at every corner, the warden himself observing. When they saw each other for the first time in weeks, something shifted in both of them. They reached across the table simultaneously, grasped hands, and for a long moment simply held on, their faces showing the first genuine emotion anyone had seen from them since their arrest. Not remorse, but something like relief, like completion. They spoke to each other in voices so low the guards couldn't make out the words. They'd lean close, whisper, sometimes nod, sometimes shake their heads. It looked like a perfectly ordinary conversation except for the circumstances, except for the intensity of their focus on each other to the exclusion of everything else. After 30 minutes, the warden ended the visit. The sisters released hands slowly, reluctantly. As they were led away in opposite directions, each turned to look back at the other until walls intervened and broke their line of sight. August 15, 1935, dawned humid and oppressive. Moundsville in summer was stifling, the stone walls of the penitentiary holding heat like an oven. The executions were scheduled for dawn, Martha at 6 a.m., Ida at 6:30 a.m., the half-hour gap designed to ensure there would be no confusion, no possibility of the wrong sister being brought to the gallows first. The state had learned from past mistakes that these details mattered, that botched executions haunted everyone involved. A small group of official witnesses gathered in the execution chamber: the warden, selected guards, a doctor who would pronounce death, representatives from the prosecutor's office, and 2 journalists who'd been granted permission to document the proceedings. No family members of the victims attended. Most were too far away, too poor to make the journey, or had no desire to witness the state-sanctioned deaths of the women who'd killed their loved ones. Some forms of closure they'd decided weren't worth the trauma of obtaining. Martha Hicks was brought in first, walking under her own power, requiring no support from the guards who flanked her. She wore a simple dress provided by the prison, her hair pulled back in the same severe style she'd always worn. She looked around the room once, her gaze passing over the gallows, a trapdoor mechanism, a rope already positioned, the whole apparatus as grimly functional as a tool in a barn, and then fixed her eyes on some middle distance, seeing something no one else could perceive. The land itself, however, retained its character. Devil's Holler remained a remote, somewhat forbidding place. People still lived in the area, though never again on the site of the Hicks homestead. The holler kept its name despite some attempts to change it, as if the designation had become too embedded in local consciousness to be altered. Hikers occasionally passed through, often unaware of the history. Those who did know would sometimes pause at the overgrown site, would look around at the forest and the creek and the mountains rising on either side, and would try to imagine what it had been like when 2 women had turned this beautiful place into a killing ground. In recent decades, there have been efforts to document the case more thoroughly, to preserve what records remain, to interview the now elderly descendants of people who'd known the sisters or remembered the trial. These efforts have been partially successful, adding details here and there, but much has simply been lost to time. The people who could have answered certain questions are dead. The physical evidence is gone. What remains is the outline of the story, clear in its broad strokes but frustratingly vague in its particulars. There is no monument to the victims, no marker commemorating what happened. This isn't unusual. Society rarely memorializes the sites of serial murders, preferring to let them fade into the landscape, to be forgotten. But this erasure, while understandable, also feels like a loss. The men who died in Devil's Holler deserved more than to be absorbed into folklore, to become plot points in a story about their killers. They deserve to be remembered as individuals, as people whose lives had value beyond the manner of their deaths. Some families maintained that remembrance privately. Descendants of Robert Cochran, for instance, preserved his memory through stories passed down, through photographs kept and treasured, through the acknowledgement that he'd been a good man who'd met a terrible fate. These private memorials, invisible to outsiders but deeply meaningful to those who maintained them, ensured that at least some of the victims weren't entirely lost to history. The psychological legacy of the case extended beyond the direct participants. Communities throughout Appalachia, reading about the Hicks sisters in their newspapers, wondered about their own remote homesteads, their own isolated neighbors. Suspicion, always present in some degree in rural areas where people lived far apart and visited infrequently, intensified. People became more cautious about whom they trusted, more careful about where they stopped when traveling. The assumption of basic hospitality, that you could knock on a door and expect at least water and directions, was damaged, replaced by wariness that took years to dissipate. Law enforcement changed as well. The Hicks case demonstrated the vulnerabilities in how missing persons were handled, particularly when the missing were transient or marginal. It showed that serial murder wasn't purely an urban phenomenon, that it could occur in remote rural areas where isolation enabled predators and hindered investigation. Sheriff's departments began paying more attention to patterns of disappearances, to clusters of missing persons reports, to the possibility that what seemed like tragic accidents might actually be crimes. The case also highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes in remote areas with limited resources. Greenbrier County in the 1930s had a small sheriff's department, primitive communication technology, no forensic laboratory, and vast territory to cover. When crimes occurred in isolated locations like Devil's Holler, responding effectively was enormously difficult. This reality wouldn't fundamentally change for decades, but awareness of the problem at least increased. In popular culture, the Hicks sisters became reference points, archetypes of a particular kind of killer. When true crime writers discussed female serial murderers, the sisters were often mentioned. When discussions turned to partners in murder, to the dynamics that allowed two people to kill together, the case came up. They were never as famous as some serial killers. Their crimes lacked the dramatic flair that captured public imagination, and the era in which they killed was receding into history. But within certain circles among people who studied such things, they were well known. There were occasional attempts to adapt the story for dramatic purposes. A play written in the 1970s, never widely produced. A novel published in the 1980s that took significant liberties with the facts. Various podcast episodes and documentary segments in the 21st century as true crime became a major entertainment genre. Each adaptation wrestled with the question of how to tell the story responsibly, how to acknowledge the horror without sensationalizing it, how to explore the sisters' psychology without seeming to excuse their actions, how to honor the victims while still creating compelling narrative. Some adaptations succeeded better than others, but all faced the fundamental challenge that the case itself presented. How do you make sense of senseless violence? How do you explain evil, particularly evil that emerged from circumstances that many people experienced without becoming evil themselves? The Depression affected millions. Poverty and isolation were common. Yet the vast majority of people in similar situations didn't become murderers. What made the Hicks sisters different? Criminologists have proposed various theories. Some suggest psychopathy, that the sisters lacked normal empathy and moral sense, and that their circumstances simply provided opportunity for latent tendencies to manifest. Others point to the twin bond, suggesting that their intense relationship created an echo chamber where normal moral reasoning couldn't penetrate, where they reinforced each other's worst impulses. Still others focus on childhood trauma, their mother's early death, their father's harsh treatment, the grinding poverty that marked their entire lives, as potential explanations. But ultimately, all such explanations remain speculative. The sisters are dead, long past the possibility of psychological evaluation. They left no written records that might illuminate their thinking, no journals or letters that might reveal their interior lives. What testimony they gave was self-serving, designed to manipulate legal outcomes, unreliable as a window into their true motivations. We're left with their actions and the bare facts of their circumstances, from which we can construct theories but never arrive at definitive answers. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some questions shouldn't have easy answers. The moment we fully understand evil, the moment we can explain it away as merely the product of circumstances or psychology or social forces, we risk normalizing it, rendering it less horrifying. The Hicks sisters should remain somewhat incomprehensible, should resist easy categorization, because what they did was genuinely monstrous and deserves to be recognized as such. At the same time, we shouldn't mythologize them. They weren't supernatural beings or embodiments of abstract evil. They were human beings who made terrible choices, who killed vulnerable people for gain, who showed no remorse when caught. Understanding them as human doesn't excuse them. It makes their crimes more disturbing, not less, because it reminds us that such evil is within the range of human possibility. We like to think that we could never do such things, that we're fundamentally different from killers, but the Hicks sisters were daughters, neighbors, community members, women who looked like other women and lived lives that looked like other lives until you looked closer and saw the horror beneath the ordinary surface. Today, more than 90 years after the sisters were executed, the case has largely faded from public consciousness outside of true crime enthusiasts and regional historians. The Hicks name doesn't resonate the way names like Gacy or Bundy do. The crimes, while terrible, were of a type that doesn't capture modern imagination the way more theatrical killers do. There's something almost medieval about the case. Travelers waylaid on remote roads, bodies buried in shallow graves, poverty-driven violence that feels like it belongs to a different era entirely. But in the communities where the crimes occurred, memory persists. People still tell stories about the sisters, still point out the trail to Devil's Holler, still feel a chill when they pass through that particular landscape. The history is local, specific, rooted in place in a way that resists erasure. As long as people live in those mountains, as long as the geography remains recognizable, the story will survive in some form, and perhaps that's as it should be. Not every horror needs to be nationally famous to matter. Local tragedies, local evils, local memories, these have value too. They remind communities of their own histories, of the darkness that can emerge even in familiar places. They serve as warnings and lessons, as stories that carry weight, precisely because they're rooted in specific locations and specific people rather than being abstract. Examples of general principles. The cave systems that honeycomb. The mountains around Devil's Holler are still there, still largely unexplored, still potentially holding secrets. It's possible, even likely, that there are remains that were never discovered, victims who weren't found even after the investigation, people who vanished into those caverns and stayed there. Every few years, someone proposes a systematic search, using modern technology like ground-penetrating radar, but the projects never materialize. The terrain is too difficult, the caves too extensive, the cost too high for the uncertain possibility of finding decades-old bones. So the mountains keep whatever secrets they hold. The forest grows thicker each year, covering the few remaining traces of the Hicks homestead. The creek runs clear and cold, the same water that once might have concealed weighted bodies now hosting trout and salamanders. Indifferent to history, time moves forward and the past recedes, and eventually even the most terrible stories become just stories, their connection to reality attenuated by distance and death until they're more legend than history. But on certain nights, and people in the area will tell you this, will insist on it despite whatever skepticism you might bring, strange things happen in Devil's Holler. Lights are seen where no lights should be, moving through the forest far from any trail. Sounds echo, voices or what might be voices calling out in the darkness. People camping in the area report feelings of overwhelming dread of being watched, of presences that drive them to pack up and leave even though they can't articulate what frightened them. Are these experiences real? Are they psychological, the product of knowing the history and letting that knowledge shape perception? Are they simply the normal sounds and sights of a forest at night, interpreted through the lens of expectation? There's no way to know, but the reports persist, consistent enough in their details to be more than random chance, yet inexplicable enough to resist scientific explanation. Perhaps some places are genuinely haunted, not by literal ghosts, but by the weight of what occurred there, by history that somehow impresses itself on a location and persists beyond the physical lives of those involved. Perhaps the violence that saturated the Hicks homestead for years left some kind of mark, something that sensitive people can detect even decades later. Or perhaps people simply need their stories to have supernatural elements, need the evil to persist beyond the merely physical, so that it can be confronted and acknowledged in ways that pure historical fact doesn't allow. Whatever the explanation, Devil's Holler retains its reputation as a place to avoid, a location where the boundary between past and present feels unusually thin. Hunters who regularly traverse the mountains will often route around it, taking longer paths rather than cut through that particular valley. When asked why, they'll usually shrug, say they just don't like the feel of the place, offer practical reasons about terrain or game distribution that don't quite explain the avoidance. But press them, particularly if you've established trust, and they'll sometimes admit, there's something wrong there. Something that makes you want to leave. Something that reminds you that evil isn't just a concept, but a real force that existed in that place and might, in some way, still exist. The last known survivor of the trial, a man who'd been a young reporter covering the case for a regional newspaper, died in 2003 at the age of 94. Before his death, he gave several interviews about his memories of the case, and his reflections are worth considering. He described watching the sisters in the courtroom, trying to understand how they could sit there so calmly while the evidence of their crimes was presented. He remembered the executions, which he'd witnessed as part of his reporting duty, and how they'd affected him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'd expected to feel satisfaction," he said in one interview, justice being done, evil being punished. But what I felt instead was emptiness. Like something had been removed from the world, but nothing had been added to replace it. The sisters were gone, but the men they killed were still dead, and their families were still broken, and nothing had been made right. It was just endings, nothing else. He also reflected on how the case had changed his understanding of evil. Before covering the Hicks trial, he'd thought of criminals as obviously different from normal people, marked by their crimes in some visible way. But the sisters had looked ordinary. They'd spoken ordinary words. They'd been comprehensible on a surface level, even as their actions revealed depths of depravity that defied comprehension. That was the scariest thing, he said. Not what they did, though that was terrible, but how normal they seemed while doing it. Like killing people was just another chore. Like weeding the garden or feeding the chickens. That's what stayed with me all these years. The ordinariness of extraordinary evil. His death marked a kind of endpoint. With his passing, everyone who'd directly witnessed the crimes, the trial, or the executions was gone. The case had fully transitioned from living memory to history, preserved only in documents and second-hand accounts and the stories people told. This transition happens to all historical events eventually, but there's something final about it, something that changes the nature of how we relate to the past. Without living witnesses, the case becomes more abstract, easier to analyze dispassionately, less immediate in its emotional impact. We can discuss it academically, can theorize about motivations and circumstances, can draw lessons and make comparisons, but we lose the visceral connection that comes from hearing someone who was there, who smelled the fear in the courtroom, who saw the sisters' faces as the verdicts were read, who heard the trapdoor open, and witnessed the executions firsthand. That loss is inevitable but significant. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in documenting Appalachian history more thoroughly, in preserving stories that were previously dismissed as too local, too marginal, too poor to matter. The Hicks case has benefited from this trend, with local historical societies collecting what records remain, interviewing descendants of people involved, trying to establish a more complete picture of what happened. These efforts are valuable, though they're also racing against time. Every year that passes, more documents are lost, more memories fade, more pieces of the story disappear. What emerges from these research efforts is a more nuanced understanding of the case. Not one that excuses the sisters, but one that places them more fully in their context. We learn about the specific pressures of life in Greenbrier County during the Depression, about the breakdown of social services, about the desperation that drove some people to extremes. We learn about the victims in more detail, about their lives before they encountered the sisters, about the ripple effects their disappearances had on families and communities. We also learn about the investigation, about Sheriff Hargrove's persistent unease and limited resources, about the challenges of building a case without modern forensic tools, about the role of luck and eventual confession in bringing the sisters to justice. The case wasn't solved through brilliant detective work, but through the breakdown of the partnership between the twins, through Ida's decision, for whatever reason, to confess. Without that confession, it's possible the crimes would never have been fully revealed, that the sisters might have died of old age with their secrets intact. This is a sobering realization. How many other cases in other locations involved killers who were never caught, because the right combination of circumstances never aligned to reveal them? How many people disappeared into remote places, murdered by opportunistic predators who successfully hid their crimes? The Hicks sisters were caught, but they were also in some ways anomalous. Their partnership broke down, one confessed. The investigation had just enough resources to follow up. Remove any of these factors, and they might have remained hidden. The case also raises questions about our relationship with true crime as entertainment. The story of the Hicks sisters is horrifying, but it's also compelling in the way that stories of extreme transgression often are. We're drawn to accounts of serial killers, of crimes that violate our deepest taboos even as we recoil from them. There's something morally complicated about this attraction, about turning real suffering into narrative entertainment. As someone creating this account, I'm aware of this tension. I'm telling you a story that's meant to engage you, to hold your attention, to provide a certain kind of dark fascination, but that story is built on real deaths, real suffering, real families destroyed. The men who died in Devil's Holler weren't characters in a narrative. They were human beings who experienced terror and pain in their final moments, whose deaths left wounds in the lives of people who loved them. So how do we tell these stories responsibly? How do we acknowledge the horror without exploiting it? How do we create compelling narratives while still honoring the victims? There are no easy answers. The best we can do, perhaps, is to remain conscious of these tensions, to resist the temptation to sensationalize, to remember that behind the dramatic structure of crime and investigation and justice are real people whose lives mattered beyond their role in this story. The Hicks sisters killed for profit, for survival as they understood it, for small amounts of money and possessions that seemed valuable to them in their desperate poverty. But the cost of those acquisitions, measured in human lives and suffering, in the long aftermath of trauma for families and communities, was incalculable. There's no equation that balances that ledger, no way to say that their desperation justified their actions or that their punishment made things right. There's just the reality of what happened, the weight of it, the way it continues to echo through time. In the broader context of American history, the Hicks case represents something about the Depression era that often gets overlooked in discussions focused on urban breadlines and industrial collapse. Rural poverty, particularly in regions like Appalachia, created conditions of desperation that pushed some people beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. The sisters weren't unique in facing starvation and hardship. Millions of Americans faced similar circumstances. But they were among the very few who responded to those circumstances with serial murder. This distinction is crucial. Poverty doesn't create killers. Desperation doesn't excuse evil. The vast majority of people who suffered during the Depression remained fundamentally decent, found ways to survive without victimizing others, maintained their humanity despite circumstances that tested it severely. The Hicks sisters made choices that most people in similar situations didn't make, and they bear responsibility for those choices regardless of how limited their options might have seemed. At the same time, we can acknowledge that systemic failures contributed to creating the conditions in which their crimes occurred. A society that abandoned its most marginal members, that provided no safety net for people like the sisters, that allowed rural communities to sink into isolation and poverty without intervention. Such a society created vulnerabilities that predators could exploit. This doesn't excuse the predators, but it does suggest that preventing such crimes requires attention to the conditions that enable them. If the Hicks sisters had been born into different circumstances, if they'd had education, economic opportunity, connection to broader social networks, would they still have become killers? It's impossible to know. Perhaps the capacity for such violence was inherent in them, would have manifested regardless of circumstances. Perhaps their poverty and isolation were determinative, pushing them toward crimes they wouldn't otherwise have contemplated. Most likely, it was some complex interaction of innate tendencies and environmental pressures, nature and nurture combining to produce a result that neither alone would have created. These are the kinds of questions that make the case enduringly fascinating. For those who study criminal psychology and sociology, the Hicks sisters weren't insane in any clinical sense. They understood their actions, planned them carefully, took steps to avoid detection. But they also seemed to lack some fundamental emotional capacity that most humans possess. Some empathy or moral sense that would have prevented them from killing vulnerable people for minor gain. Were they born that way? Shaped that way? Some combination? We can only speculate. What we can say with certainty is that their crimes had ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The families destroyed by grief and unanswered questions. The community traumatized by the revelation that such evil had existed among them. The investigators who carried the psychological weight of what they'd discovered. The trial observers who witnessed the sisters' complete lack of remorse. Even the executioner, anonymous and professional, must have been affected by hanging women who showed less fear of death than some people show ordering in a restaurant. These secondary victims, if we can call them that, rarely feature prominently in accounts of serial murder, but their experiences matter too. When evil of this magnitude enters a community, it changes things fundamentally. Trust becomes harder. The assumption of basic human decency is damaged. People become more suspicious, more fearful, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces. This psychological legacy persists in subtle ways. Even people born long after the executions, who know the story only as history, feel its influence. They avoid certain places. They tell their children to be careful. They carry forward a wariness that originated in events they never witnessed, but that shaped the culture they inherited. This is how trauma echoes through generations. How violence committed in one era affects people decades later. The landscape itself bears witness to this history. Devil's Holler remains largely unchanged in its essential character despite the passage of time. The mountains rise on either side, Forested slopes marked by outcrops of limestone. The creek still runs clear following its ancient course. The trails still wind through the forest, maintained now more by deer than human traffic. In spring, wildflowers still bloom in that valley, indifferent to the history of the place. In autumn, leaves turn golden red and fall, covering whatever remnants might remain of the Hicks homestead. There's something almost cruel about this continuity, this persistence of natural beauty in a place marked by human ugliness. But perhaps it's also a kind of redemption. The earth doesn't hold grudges, doesn't memorialize evil except through our stories about it. The land that saw terrible crimes also supports new life, sustains ecosystems, provides habitat for countless creatures who live and die without awareness of human history. Nature moves on, and eventually so do we. But we shouldn't move on too quickly, shouldn't forget too easily. The story of Martha and Ida Hicks deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, not sensationalized, but remembered. Remembered for what it tells us about human capacity for evil. Remembered for what it reveals about the failures of society to protect its most vulnerable members, both the sisters themselves when they were children facing abuse and poverty, and the men they would later victimize. Remembered as a warning about what isolation and desperation can breed. Remembered out of respect for the victims whose lives ended in that remote holler, whose deaths went unnoticed for too long, who deserve to be more than footnotes in a story about their killers. There are lessons here, though they're not simple ones, about the importance of maintaining social connections that provide both support and accountability, about the need for economic safety nets that prevent the kind of absolute desperation that can push people toward extreme acts, about the responsibility communities have to investigate suspicions rather than simply whisper about them, about the ways that poverty and isolation can create conditions where evil thrives undetected. But perhaps the deepest lesson is simply this. Human nature contains multitudes, including terrible possibilities that most of us will never actualize but which exist nonetheless. The Hicks sisters weren't supernatural monsters. They were human beings who made monstrous choices. Understanding this is uncomfortable, because it removes the comforting distance between us and them, forces us to acknowledge that the capacity for such evil isn't the exclusive province of some separate category of being, but exists, dormant and theoretical but real within the human condition itself. This doesn't mean we're all potential serial killers. We're not. Most people will never commit acts remotely comparable to what the Hicks sisters did, but it does mean that evil isn't something wholly external to human nature, isn't a force that invades from outside, but rather something that can emerge from within, given the wrong combination of circumstances, psychology, and choice. Recognizing this is crucial to understanding how to prevent such crimes, how to identify warning signs, how to intervene before desperation becomes violence. The story of the Hicks sisters is ultimately a story about failure of society to provide for its members, failure of community to act on suspicions, failure of human empathy in two women who should have been capable of better. But it's also a story about eventual justice, about an investigation that persisted despite obstacles, about a legal system that functioned even in difficult circumstances, about a society that, however belatedly, said that such evil would not be tolerated. Was justice truly served? The sisters were caught, tried, and executed according to law. The process was as fair as the era's standards allowed. They had legal representation, a public trial, the right to present their case. By the standards of 1935, justice was done. But did executing them restore anything? Did it heal the families of victims? Did it make the community whole again? These are harder questions, and the answers are almost certainly no. Justice in cases like this is always incomplete, always inadequate to the magnitude of harm caused. Yet what alternative existed? The sisters showed no remorse, no possibility of rehabilitation, no capacity for the kind of moral transformation that might have made clemency possible. They understood what they'd done and weren't sorry. In such cases, society's options are limited. The execution of the Hicks sisters wasn't about revenge, or at least, it shouldn't have been, but about acknowledging that some acts place people beyond the possibility of return to society, that some evils require permanent removal of the perpetrators from the human community. Modern debates about capital punishment would analyze the case differently, would raise questions about whether the state should have the power to take life, whether execution serves any purpose beyond retribution, whether the process itself is too flawed to justify its application. These are valid questions, and the Hicks case doesn't provide easy answers to them. What it does provide is a historical example of how justice was understood and implemented in a particular time and place, with all the moral complexity that entails. For the families of victims, the executions likely brought some measure of closure, though closure is a simplistic term for the complex mix of emotions, grief, anger, relief, emptiness, that follows the resolution of such cases. Robert Cochran's widow could stop wondering what had happened to her husband, could have some finality even if she couldn't have him back. Jack Sullivan's brother could know that his sibling's death had been acknowledged, that the killers had faced justice. This knowledge couldn't undo the deaths, couldn't restore what was lost, but it was something. In the face of overwhelming loss, even small certainties can matter. The community, too, needed the resolution. The revelation of the sisters' crimes had shaken fundamental assumptions about safety and trust. Knowing that the killers had been caught and punished allowed for the beginning of healing, for the slow rebuilding of the sense that justice existed and could be relied upon. It didn't happen quickly. Trust, once broken, is slow to repair. But it did happen. Eventually, Devil's Holler became just another place in the mountains, its history known but no longer defining its present. Today, more than 90 years after these events unfolded in the mountains of West Virginia, the story of Martha and Ida Hicks remains a disturbing reminder that evil can emerge in the most unexpected places, can wear the most ordinary faces, can thrive in isolation and desperation. It reminds us that poverty and marginalization create vulnerabilities, not excuses for violence, but conditions that can enable those already inclined toward evil to act on their inclinations without detection. The case challenges us to think about how we structure our societies, how we care for our most marginal members, how we balance respect for privacy and independence against the need for oversight and intervention. The Hicks sisters lived in an era and a place where people were largely left to manage their own affairs, where the state had limited reach into remote areas, where neighbors minded their own business out of respect for autonomy. This cultural pattern had virtues, but it also had costs, as the case so tragically demonstrates. It challenges us, too, to think about how we respond to suspicion and unease. Sheriff Hargrove felt something was wrong during his visits to the Hicks homestead, but he had no evidence, no grounds for action beyond instinct. How do we balance the need to investigate suspicions against the rights of people to be free from harassment, based on nothing more than the way they make others feel? There are no easy answers to this question, but the Hicks case shows the stakes involved when we get the balance wrong. But questions remain, as they always do in cases this complex. How many victims were there really? 10, 12, 20? The true number was taken to the grave by the sisters, buried with them in the prison cemetery, lost to history. What motivated them truly? Was it purely mercenary? Or was there some darker psychological satisfaction in the killing itself? Their statements suggested the former, but their lack of remorse might indicate the latter. We'll never know with certainty. What would have happened if Ida hadn't confessed? Would the crimes have been discovered anyway? Or would the sisters have continued until age or illness stopped them? If they'd never been caught, would they be remembered at all? Or would they simply be two obscure women who lived and died in the mountains, their secrets buried with them? These counterfactuals remind us how contingent justice can be, how much depends on chance and circumstance rather than inevitable revelation. And what of the victims we don't know about? The men who disappeared without anyone filing reports, without anyone noting their absence? They existed, almost certainly. People who were so marginal to society that their vanishing left no trace in the official record. They matter too, even though we can't name them, even though we can't honor them individually. Somewhere in Devil's Holler, in those hills and caves and creek beds, their remains may still lie undiscovered. The earth keeps their secrets, and perhaps that's their memorial, to rest in the mountains they were traveling through when death found them. To this day, when the wind moves through the trees in Devil's Holler, when fog settles into the valley on autumn mornings, when the creek runs high with spring melt, people who live in the area report still feeling something unsettled about that place. Not everyone. Some pass through without incident, without awareness. But enough people over enough years have reported discomfort, unease, a sense of wrongness that the reputation persists. Whether this is psychological, the power of knowing the history shaping perception, or whether places can genuinely retain some imprint of the violence that occurred there, is a question each person must answer for themselves. What's undeniable is that the story persists, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but never quite forgotten. In an age of mass media and national news cycles, when horrors compete for attention and yesterday's atrocity is quickly displaced by today's, there's something almost comforting about a story that remains rooted in place, that belongs to a specific community and landscape. The Hicks case isn't famous in the way some crimes are, won't be the subject of major Hollywood productions, won't enter the popular consciousness as a household name, but within the mountains where it occurred, it endures as living memory transitioning to folklore, a cautionary tale about what darkness can dwell in isolated places, and on quiet nights, when the mountains are still and the stars are bright in the clear Appalachian sky, when you're traveling those back roads that wind through hollers and over ridges, when you pass a turnoff that leads into darkness between the trees. You might think of the Hicks sisters. You might wonder what that trail leads to, what stories that landscape could tell if it could speak. You might feel a moment of unease, a primitive recognition that not all places are safe, that not all people are trustworthy, that evil is real, and has been real, and will be real again. That feeling, that awareness, is part of the legacy of Martha and Ida Hicks. Not the only part, not the most important part, but a real part nonetheless. They taught a community to be more cautious, more aware, more alert to the possibility that ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary malevolence. It's a hard lesson, a bitter one, purchased at terrible cost, but it's a lesson that potentially saved lives, that made people less vulnerable to predators who came after, that created a wariness that, while damaging to some degree, also provided protection. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself contemplating the complex intersections of poverty, isolation, desperation, and evil that created this tragedy, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the seriousness and respect they warrant, stories of forgotten people in forgotten places, of crimes that shaped communities even as they disappeared from broader historical consciousness, of the constant human struggle between our better and worse natures. Leave a like if this account has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. If you've been challenged to think about difficult questions without easy answers, if you've felt the weight of real tragedy conveyed through careful narrative, and comment sharing your own perspectives on what we owe to the dead, how we should remember evil without glorifying it, whether understanding circumstances that produce criminals means we excuse the crimes themselves, or any other thoughts this story has sparked. Share your location. Where are you watching from? How far removed, geographically or culturally, from the Appalachian Mountains of the 1930s? Does distance make these events seem less real? Or does good storytelling transcend such boundaries and make the past immediate regardless of miles and years? These stories matter, not because they're entertaining, though they are compelling in that dark way that human nature seems drawn to. They matter because they're true, because they happen to real people, because they reveal aspects of human nature and social organization that we need to understand if we're to build better communities and prevent such tragedies in the future. They matter because remembering the dead, even when their deaths occurred 90 years ago in a remote holler most people will never visit, is a fundamental human obligation, a way of saying that every life has value, that every unjust death deserves acknowledgement. The Hicks sisters are long dead. Their bodies decayed to bones and dust, their consciousness, whatever that was, extinguished. Their victims are equally gone, returned to the earth they fell on, their stories mostly lost except for the manner of their deaths, but the case itself lives on, carried forward by those who tell it, by those who listen, by the communities that preserve the memory and pass it down. In that telling and listening and remembering, something essential happens. The victims are honored. The evil is named and condemned. The lessons are extracted and considered. The past which cannot be changed is at least not forgotten. Until the next time we journey together into the shadows of history, into those places where human nature reveals its darkest capacities, and where the struggle for justice plays out across years and decades. Remember this: the world is more complex than our categories for understanding it allow. Good and evil exist, but they exist in complicated relationships with circumstance, psychology, choice, and chance. Every story of horror is also a story of failure. Failure to protect, to notice, to intervene, to provide the conditions under which people can survive without victimizing others. And every story of horror is also a story of victims who deserved better, who deserved to live, whose deaths diminished the world in ways large and small. Robert Cochran, traveling the mountain roads to support his family. Jack Sullivan, looking for work and dignity in an era that offered neither. The other men, named and unnamed, who crossed paths with evil and didn't survive the encounter. They're gone, but they're not forgotten, not entirely. Not as long as someone is still willing to tell their stories, to say their names when they're known, to acknowledge their absence when they're not. The mountains of West Virginia still stand, ancient and enduring, indifferent to human drama. The forests still grow thick on their slopes, The caves still tunnel through limestone, dark and mysterious and full of secrets. Devil's Holler is still there, overgrown and empty, marked only by those who know its history. And somewhere in that landscape, in the earth and stone and water, fragments of bone may still lie hidden, last physical traces of people who lived and died and whose stories ended in that remote place. The earth remembers, in its way. The landscape is marked whether we can perceive those marks or not. And we remember too, imperfectly but deliberately, because remembering is what makes us human, what connects us across time to those who came before, what allows us to learn from the past even as we can't change it. This has been the Untold Hour. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through one of Appalachia's most disturbing historical mysteries. May the victims rest in peace. May their families have found what healing time allows. And may we all remember that the capacity for both evil and justice resides in human hands, and that which one prevails depends on choices we make, individually and collectively, every day. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, stay aware of the darkness, but don't let it overwhelm the light. There are more stories to tell, more journeys to take together. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.